After previous stories in this new phase of High Republic stories, I didn't come into this book with my typical expectations, but I had an absolute blast reading this. I've always been a fan of the mystery genre, and this incorporated that well in ways that were reminiscent of other Star Wars novels like Master and Apprentice or Padawan. The story quickly sets the scene, and it didn't take long for me to really understand the war happening between Eiram and E'ronoh, and what it meant to both sides. This event has been a reoccurring topic of conversation in the High Republic during both phases, so I was really looking forward to finally getting to read about it, and it delivered on all fronts. I could feel the history behind the war, which has been raging for generations, and it was an effective way to compare the cultures of both planets and see their beliefs in relation to the war. Some parts were easier to follow than others, and I thought that there were some important parts that were skipped over or brushed over very quickly, but it never prohibited me from understanding the broader story for the time being. Something that really stood out to me in this book was how many characters there were and how many of them I enjoyed getting to learn more about. I initially had a problem with connecting the names to the characters, but having the audiobook helped with that. Especially coming off of Andor, I think a major reason that the characters stood out to me was that I had a genuine concern throughout much of the book that a specific people might not make it out alive. For all that Andor did great, the looming threat of death was something that I felt was specifically lacking, especially throughout the second half of the season. It also became much easier when the story became much more focused throughout the middle chapters, and there were only 4 main people that I had to differentiate between, which allowed me to focus more on who they all were. I'd say there are about 4 or 5 main characters that are pretty much in every chapter, with about the same amount of supporting characters that have a big impact, and I really felt that I was able to get to know them all, even though they were all introduced for the first time in this book. All of the main characters had incredible journeys that had me encapsulated the entire way through, and each of them felt unique to me. Ziri Elberon, heir to E'ronoh, and Fan 2, heir to Eiram, were the perfect dyad to lead the story forward. Even after they were at first introduced and met by chance, I would have never guessed that they would grow together and become the stars of the book. Their personalities balance each other out, and even though they have only met recently, as the reader I could still feel a connection between them that felt realistic and full of life. While it is a love story, their roles as heirs to the specific planet add a very different aspect to the story as lovers. While I don't know how likely it is that they continue to show up in future stories in this era, I would love nothing more than for these characters to continue to have their story fleshed out and expanded upon, because I truly felt like they were some of the best characters the High Republic has introduced us to, despite them not being Jedis. Axel Greylark, on the other hand, could not have been more different of a character. As soon as he was first introduced as the Chancellor's son, gambling on the lower levels of Coruscant, I had a feeling I was going to love the character. But the way his story is written and developed threw me for so many loops that I never knew what was coming. There were aspects of the book that felt extremely predictable when it came to big twists, mostly because they mirrored story beats from Phase 1, which was a bit disappointing to me, but in terms of individual character arcs, I almost never had the problem. Especially with someone like Axel, who has so many different faces and complex relationships with nearly everyone. I always thought that there were 2 or 3 reasonable choices he could make to any given situation. And lastly, while Gala and Natty may not have been my favorite character to come out of the book, including a Jedi in the group not only let us as readers get some more details about what the Order is like at this point in time, but it also brings out some very interesting beliefs and attitudes towards the Jedi Order and those that can use the Force, which was a major point with the Path of the Open Hand. I've read a lot of Star Wars books recently, and in the nearly 2 years since Light of the Jedi, none of the dozens that I've read have done this good of a job of introducing such an amazing and well-rounded cast of brand new characters. While the book began with an overwhelming amount of new characters, once these 4 went out on their own separate journey, it felt like a classic Star Wars adventure, with the 4 contrasting personalities off on their own mission after only just meeting each other. The Path of the Open Hand also plays a role in the story, and it took me a while to get completely on board with it, partially because I just wasn't a fan of them when it was first introduced in Path of Deceit. To me, they just haven't displayed the same level of threat that the Nihil did when we were immediately introduced, but it's unfair for me to compare the two villains from two different periods of time. Including the path was a good way to tie this story to the larger galaxy at the time, since we know that they're going to be impacting events in the near future on a grand scale. But there were times when I thought that their inclusion was distracting from the overall story. However, I think that as their inclusion became more central to the story, and more characters became aware of them, I stopped having the feeling that it became a nice addition to the story about being told. It's been a while since I've gotten into an audiobook, and for the most part I really enjoyed this one. A lot of the music added to my experience and elevated the emotions or tone of the specific scene. Normally I have a problem with being distracted when an iconic John Williams piece is used during a smaller scene because of the different scales of story, but I never found myself having that problem too often. A lot of the character voices felt real, and it didn't take long for me to be able to distinguish who was who just by listening to the voice. I gushed about it earlier, but if you're a fan of character-centric stories, then I highly recommend picking this up, whether you're into the High Republic or not. It's still unclear how this story will tie into the rest of the second phase of High Republic, but since it is the first adult novel, I'm sure it'll have a big impact on where the story goes from here. It's a great read that focuses more on the galaxy as a whole, with a good portion centered around the Jedi, compared to the Path of Deceit, which was relatively centered on one group. If you've been enjoying the High Republic so far, I would definitely recommend getting into this one, even if you're only picking and choosing which ones to read. The majority of it is well written, and it's currently my favorite from the New Faces stories. It's also very easy to read on its own, or to start the High Republic from here. It has its connections here and there, but it's a largely brand new story and group of characters that don't require any previous knowledge. Convergence introduces an excellent cast of new characters throughout a thrilling and compelling story full of complex themes, earning a rating of 8.5 out of 10. Let me know what you thought of Convergence in the comments below, or if you'll be picking it up after this. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for more in-depth reviews like this, as well as up-to-date news stories, Star Wars lore, gaming videos, and more. As always, thank you for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you, always.